Of course, cheerful are the men around because the events are fashioned like that. We'll give you a rundown on the events every week. Welcome once again to News Analysis. News Analysis, a weekly magazine on current affairs. To begin with the main points in a nutshell. Iraq Vice President vetoes new election law. Afghans blame poverty for war. South Africa probing Guinea mercenaries. Trade talks and Obama-China trip. European Union, Russia to reset ties at Stockholm summit. Indian farmers protest against land bill. Another news in detail. Iraq Vice President vetoes new election law. One of Iraq's two vice presidents has vetoed part of the country's new election law, putting the parliamentary polls scheduled for January in doubt. Tariq al-Hashemi, Sunni Arab, revoked Article 1 of the law and called for the representation in parliament of displaced people to increase to 15%. Most Iraqis who have fled violence since 2003 are thought to be Sunni. The law, which MPs approved after much delay in 10 days ago, will now go back to Parliament for further discussion. Mr. Hashemi said he believed the issue could be dealt with in one parliamentary session and need not delay the elections, although the Iraqi Independent Election Commission and the UN have warned time is running out. No final date has been set for the election, but it's expected to be held close to 18th January. Constitutionally, it must be held before the end of that month. The election is seen as a prerequisite to the US meeting its goal of pulling out the combat troops by August. Afghans blame poverty on war. Poverty and unemployment are overwhelmingly seen as the main reason behind the conflict in Afghanistan, according to a survey in that country. British aid agency Oxfam, which questioned 704 Afghans, said 7 out of 10 respondents blame these factors on war. Taliban violence was seen as less important than the government weakness and corruption, according to the poll. Oxfam said the survey showed that the country needed more than military solutions. 1 in 5 said they had been tortured, and 1 in 10 claimed to have been imprisoned at least once since 1979, when Soviet forces invaded. Based on what those surveys said, 1 in 6 Afghans are considering leaving the country. 3/4 of Afghans have been forced to leave their homes since 1979. 1 in every 10 Afghans have been imprisoned at least once. 8 Afghan non-governmental organizations helped conduct the poll in 14 provinces across the country between January and April 2009, Oxfam said. Those interviewed, it adds, were men and women selected at random. The fourth most important factor behind the fighting, according to the survey published in a report entitled "The Cost of War," was interference by neighboring countries. The people of Afghanistan have suffered 30 years of unrelenting horror, said Oxfam Chief Executive Barbara Stocking. In that time, millions have been killed and millions more have fled their homes. Those who have committed the most terrible abuses have enjoyed impunity rather than face justice. Afghan society has been devastated. South Africa probing Guinea mercenaries. South Africa's government says it's investigating reports that South African mercenaries are training supporters of Guinea's military junta. Such announcement appears to give substance to all the allegations. There have been reports in the French media South Africans training recruits at a camp south of Konkanki. The junta has been fiercely criticized for a deadly crackdown on opposition supporters in September. Human rights groups say more than 150 people were killed when troops fired on anti-government protests and many women systematically raped. Guinean officials say 57 people died and that most were trampled to death. The protest was called in protest at rumors that Captain Moussa Dadis Camara, who seized power last December, planned to run for president next year despite a promise not to. Trade talks and Obama's China trip. U.S. President Barack Obama has met Chinese Premier Wen Jiabao on the last day of his much-watched visit to the racing Asian powerhouse, China. Trade disputes were expected to be on the agenda during Mr. Obama's lunch with China's third-highest leader, who is responsible for the economy and its rise in the world power. Reports quoted the Chinese premier as having urged a steady balancing of trade with the U.S. during the talks. Mr. Obama later visited China's Great Wall before heading to South Korea. The U.S. president, who is on a week-long tour of East Asia, is expected to focus on North Korea's nuclear ambitions during talks in Seoul. Before Wednesday's meeting with Chinese Prime Minister, Mr. Obama said Washington-Beijing relationship was now about more than trade and economics. European Union, Russia to reset ties at the summit. European Union leaders are due to discuss key issues such as trade and energy with Russian counterparts at a summit in Stockholm. Moscow and Brussels are still rebuilding relations after falling out of last year's Georgia-Russia war. The European Union will also seek assurance that there will be no repeat of last winter's disruption of gas exports to the West. And Brussels wants to know if Russia is still interested in joining the World Trade Organization, WTO. The European Union, which represents 500 million people, is Moscow's biggest partner and depends heavily on Russian gas. Moscow, meanwhile, is seeking more foreign investment. Israeli settlement plan denounced. The U.S. and UN have criticized Israel's approval of 900 extra housing units at a Jewish settlement in East Jerusalem. White House spokesman Robert Gibbs and UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon said the move would hamper Israeli-Palestinian peace talks. Their remarks came after Israel's Interior Ministry approved planning applications for the new units. The Planning and Construction Committee authorized the expansion of Gilo, which is built on land captured in 1967. The land was later annexed to the Jerusalem municipality. Farmers protest against land bill. Hundreds of farmers have gathered on the outskirts of the Indian capital, Delhi, to protest against the move to amend a land acquisition bill. Farmers miss amending the 115-year-old Land Acquisition Act will make it easier for the authorities to acquire their land for projects. The issue of land acquisition is a very sensitive one, with 65% of the country's population dependent on farming. The three-day protest is supported by the campaign groups from 15 Indian states. The Land Acquisition Amendment Bill 2009, which the government has proposed, will further relax all provisions which will lead to an easier acquisition of land by the authorities, says Mudhresh, who works for Sangharsh, an umbrella of 150 groups participating in the protest. According to the Land Acquisition Act of 1894, the government has the power over all property and it can take over any private land for a public purpose. Queen to set Brown program. The Queen is preparing to set out the government's final program of planned laws ahead of the general election. It is expected to put into law a pledge to have the budget deficit within 4 years and pledge to stop reckless bankers from getting bonuses. Other measures are set to include free social care for the most needy, which Gordon Brown has said